Well, good evening. Welcome to Midweek Bible Study. So glad to be here with you, even though it's on video. I want to encourage you again to be with us in person if you can. If that's physically possible, we would love to have you. That gives us an opportunity to have some conversation surrounding the text that we're working with. Last week, and we did it live last week, I was on vacation last week, and so Chris filled in for me and did that live. If you missed out on that, I certainly apologize, but that was chapter 22 of Isaiah. This week we're going to get into chapter 23. It's, again, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, you get the ups and the downs here, and Isaiah has a lot of judgment in it, but it's talking about what will come, and it's because of disobedience, it's because of the oppression, it's because of a lot of things. What's interesting to me is that when you start reading this, if you really understood what was going on in the background, it would kind of give you a picture of why God did what he did. For what it's worth, last night we had our Bible study, if you will, walking through with the chosen. And one of the comments that someone made after we finished watching the first episode and we got into discussion over it, one of the conversations parts that was brought up was surrounding the fact that it was incredibly dark in the area, and it's not a color perspective. It's the fact that it was so overwhelmingly oppressed, and the people were so broken down and beaten down by the Romans that it was hard to understand how you could move through that and move away from it. And even to the perspective of the coming Messiah, setting up a kingdom, building a kingdom, you can start getting the picture visually of what that might have meant to those people and why even that some of them got to the point where they didn't understand the exact mission that Jesus was on. And it was certainly to set up a kingdom, but that kingdom was going to be something that was much greater than an earthly kingdom. And but to be able to walk through that. And so Isaiah is really kind of in a similar boat where he's watching mass issues, and it's certainly a heart problem with the people. God painstakingly went through, God was very specific about what he did as it related to how we were to worship, how we were to approach him, and how we were to fall into line, if you will, for lack of better words. And the fact of the matter is, all we have to do is follow those directions, and then we'll be right with God. The problem is we don't, and we start trying to do it our own way, and unfortunately that's not something that's going to get us to where we need to be. So here we are. We're going to walk through our time this evening with the working on chapter 23, and I'm excited about it. I'm excited about what God is doing and what God will do with the people. But there's just a lot of ups and downs. Last week you talked about the judgment or the oracle against, or proclamation, I guess, about Jerusalem. And that talked about the coming New Jerusalem and all of that, and that's exciting. Those are exciting things. But keep in mind that's for the future. The people at the time were dealing with what they saw. This week we're going to talk about a proclamation against Tyre, and really we're going to talk about the whole area of Phoenicia, but nonetheless it's titled in here as Tyre because that's the first thing that it addresses. And so this section is going to pivot us away, if you will, from Babylon, and it's going to move on to other nations. Now, Babylon was the great city in the west, while the pivot here turns toward Tyre, which is a great city in the east. And so there are several specific differences in the cities of Babylon and Tyre. Both have great wealth, but Tyre does not have the deep cultural differences that Babylon had. And this chapter could be and has been divided several different ways, but let's focus on the two parts of it that you can see specifically in your Bible. Verses 1 through 7 is going to focus on Tyre's fall, And then verses 8 through 14 is going to focus on God's hand on Tyre's fall. And so you'll start seeing that picture. Many would ask the question why, which is what many of us do when things happen. This is going to answer that question as it relates to Tyre as we go through it. So let's get started here. The first verse, the burden against Tyre, while you ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no harbor. From the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them. And I think we understand the city of Tyre is at the center of the focus here. The ships of Tarshish refer to large ships that were used for trade. Now, Tarshish most likely refers to Tartessus on the Guadalquivir in Spain. And imagine a ship going out from port, though, and this is kind of the picture you need to grasp here. Imagine a picture of a ship going out from port, and ultimately it's going to need to return to a port or it would be lost at sea. And this is the picture here where the port is being cut off. So if you can imagine going on about your life, and then all of a sudden you have no legs to stand on. And so that's kind of where this is. Verse 2 through 4, or verses 2 through 4, it says, "Be still, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon, whom those who cross the sea have filled, and on great waters the grain of Shihor. And the harvest of the river is her revenue, and she is a marketplace for the nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea has spoken, the strength of the sea, saying, I do not labor, nor bring forth children. Neither do I rear young men, nor bring up virgins." Now, the mention of Sidon represents all of Phoenicia here, which that would include Tyre. Now, the general idea here is that Tyre had become a great economic powerhouse, and the nation of Phoenicia was buying and selling resources through Egypt, and it had equipped financially Tyre to become a great city. And it created this great economic environment that unfortunately would be destroyed in one day. And so everything, if you were in a wealthy environment, you would get to, or at least begin to, hold near and dear your wealth, and you would just begin to depend upon it, and that would be something that you would use to depend upon. And unfortunately, that's not the way God set everything up. God set everything up so that we depended upon Him for all that we needed. Verses 5 through 7, it says, "When the report reaches Egypt, they also will be in agony at the report of Tyre. Cross over to Tarshish. Wail, you inhabitants of the coastland. Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is from the ancient days, whose feet carried her far off to dwell?" Now, when the news of the destruction of the economy, the Egyptians would be it would be devastating to them as well, because all of the trade routes and all of that economic impact for that entire nation would be affected. Those trade routes would be destroyed. And what once was built to be grand would be taken down to nothing. And if you look in verses 6 and 7, there's a lament that begins here on how this could happen to such a great city as Tyre. Not as in how it happened, but literally, how could this happen? It was devastating. And it was devastating for everybody, because you got to understand that with trade, with all those things, there's a lot more folks involved here in that food chain, if you will. Now, in verses 8 through 14, the tone goes from implicit to explicit as the author addresses the main question directly, which is, who could be responsible for such a fall to an ancient and powerful city like Tyre? Now, Isaiah was quick to answer, and his answer was obviously Yahweh. Now, verses 8 and 9, it says, "Who has taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traders are honorable of the earth? The Lord of hosts has purposed it, to bring to dishonor the pride of all glory, to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth." Now, verse 9 shows the main issue with Tyre, as many of the other nations were facing judgment. And the judgment that they were facing, and the reason they were facing the judgment, was because of pride. And this nation was not exempt from that. And it was a nation that had relied upon itself, and it was willing to oppress all others for the sake of their wealth and prosperity. Now, the application for you and I here should point us toward the source of all that we have, which is God. And I wonder if we do that sometimes, because we find comfort and we find dependence on a lot of different things. Well, where does God play in that equation? I think we need to learn from some of the mistakes in these historical documents, if you will. Verse 10 says, "Overflow through your land like the river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength." Now, there's several ways of interpreting this verse, but the idea of Tarshish turning away from Tyre, or at least with that idea of Tarshish turning away from Tyre, because it doesn't seem to offer help or defense any longer, and it seems to be closest. So think about this for a moment. You begin to be dependent upon things who are powerful, because you look at them as strength. You look at all of that. And let's just use, for example, and this is not a good example, but it's the closest thing I can think of off the top of my head. Think about the impact that police have on the culture and the country that we have today. And we begin to get to a point where we depend upon them. We look up to them. We hope that they're standing in the ready to be able to protect us. But what would happen if you found out that the police department all of a sudden was fallible? In other words, they weren't as perfect as you thought they were. And keep in mind, they're just people. And I'm not suggesting any specific thing here. But if you found that the police couldn't actually help you, what would that do to your countenance, or what would that do to your demeanor, I guess? Would you feel comfortable? Would you feel safe? Well, that's the same picture that's happening here, because all of a sudden all the safety things, all the security things, all of the power stuff is gone, and all of a sudden there's no protection coming from where it used to come from. And I think the picture that you need to grasp there from a spiritual standpoint, and even from a literal standpoint, is the fact that when you don't have God in the picture, you are literally on your own. And I don't want to be too dramatic there, but that's just a fact. Verse 11 says, "He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord has given a commandment against Canaan to destroy its strongholds." Now, this highlights the ability and the power that God alone possesses to dish out punishment and to dish out judgment. Understand, I've known people in my lifetime, or in my even just my ministry experience, where they have a hard time reconciling the fact that there are people in the church that do things that are not churchly or godly or any of those things. They do worldly things. And sometimes they do it to themselves. Sometimes they do it to others in the church. But I understand they're just people. Everybody's in a different degree of growth as it relates to coming to being more like Christ. But when things like that happen, for those that are lost, it's hard for them to reconcile how you could put hypocrite and church together. Those don't fit together, because what you say is supposed to be what you do, not what you say is not what you do. And that's a big problem for some people to reconcile. It's like, I don't understand. If you're supposed to be saved, and if by being saved it makes you a better person, how could you still be a worldly person in the process of that? And the funny thing is, we as people begin to judge, and sometimes it's unintentional. I would assume that a lot of times it's unintentional, because we just do this comparison thing. But the fact of the matter is, God's the judge. God is the one that's responsible for bringing them to justice. For us, we stand in judgment for what we do as individuals. So we can only be the best person that we can be, but we do it for the glory and the honor of God. We don't do it for the glory and honor of ourselves, because when we start doing that, it's when we start falling and we start making mistakes. And unfortunately, those mistakes can lead people off of a path that would have led them to righteousness, and unfortunately, sometimes we can doom them. Verse 12 says, "And he said, you will rejoice no more. O you oppressed virgin daughter of Sidon, arise, cross over to Cyprus. there also you will have no rest. Now, one interesting thing about this verse is that Isaiah didn't view Tyre as a great and majestic city of wealth and of influence. He actually saw it as a used up old woman who was picking over her ruins. And I think you kind of have to really dig into it to kind of see that picture. But for us, we read it and we just try to attach everything that happens biblically to everything that's happening in the world today, and we try to make them match up somehow. And I think we do that partially because we see the fact that Scripture should apply to us to today. The problem is we have to be able to read Scripture in context to be able to see how it fits to today. We can't just put the puzzle pieces together and shove them together and make them fit. We have to be able to take and read it in the context with which it was written and for whom it was written, and then understand how that can apply to today. And when we do it that way, we find that we're able to find a better grasp of what God is saying as opposed to trying to just make it fit. And then there becomes this little confusion thing because they don't always match up perfectly. But Isaiah saw this as a used up old woman who was picking over her ruins. And, that's a picture of a grand and majestic city at one point who's broken down and is now just picking through the ruins. Verse 13 says, "Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, this people which was not. Assyria founded it for wild beasts of the desert. They set up its towers, they raised up its palaces and brought it to ruin. Wail, you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste." Now, the idea in this is basically that man can set up mighty features to protect and even for siege, so mighty war implements, if you will. And the reference to the ships of Tarshish, those were the powerful ships of the day. They were the big ships. They were everything. And so here you have this picture of man trying to create these mighty fortresses and these mighty things, but all the great powers of the world would be no match for God and his strength. And the news of the destruction, however, too, would carry very far, which is referenced by Tarshish in verse 14. So even further away from Tyre, it would spread and the world would hear of this massive disaster. It would be as if a great country would come and fall. Verse 15, or verses 15 and 16, it says, "Now it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre will be forgotten 70 years according to the days of one king. At the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as in a song of the harlot. Take a harp, go about the city, you forgotten harlot. Make sweet melody, sing many songs, that you may be remembered." Now these few verses as well are as a reminder of the remainder of the chapter. So between these two verses and beyond, it kind of tells a story of restoration and renewal, but only through God. And if you look back at chapter 19 and what God did with Egypt, you might find a similar picture to what you see here. Now the city would be sold out to every other nation. Their great wealth would be separated and divided among every nation. The thing is, you might be remembered, but you're now just giving everything you have to everybody else, and much like a harlot to sell her wares, if you will, to everyone. It would be used poorly, I guess is the best way of putting it. And then it says, "And it shall be," and we'll address the 70 years here in just a moment, but it says, "And it shall be at the end of 70 years that the Lord will deal with Tyre. She will return to her hire and commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Her gain and her pay will be set apart for the Lord. It will not be treasured nor laid up, for her gain will be for those who dwell before the Lord to eat sufficiently and for fine clothing." Now, verse 17, as well as the references to the 70 years before, it says, "And it shall be at the end of 70 years." But for this 70 years, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly 70 years. But like in Jeremiah, it kind of stands for the fullness and completeness of time. In other words, there's a predetermined amount of time that God has determined. And when that time is complete, it's the perfect time for the next step to happen. And God would determine that, not us. Now, there would be a time when Tyre would be able to trade again, but it would only be through God that nation would be seen again. And it would be for the glory of God, not for the glory of man. And so that's the picture where you get the eat sufficiently and for the fine clothing, where there would be a renewal, but it would be for the glory and the honor of God. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly have enjoyed and continue to enjoy the study and whatnot, working through Isaiah. I know it's a lot of ups and downs, and I know that it seems, not problematic, but it just seems like, oh gosh, we just talked about that. But the fact of the matter is, I think we need to understand what Israel and the people of Israel went through to be able to make sure that we do the things right as we live our lives. I think we can learn from history, absolutely. And it's repetitive, it's over and over and over again, but the fact of the matter is we still make mistakes every day. And so we need to learn to not only own up to those, but ask for forgiveness from them, and then continue to move in a way that leads us closer to God. And Bible study certainly helps us do that, but it certainly helps us recognize what we need to do better. I pray that God will bless you, and I hope to see you soon. Look forward to seeing you live if you can, and we'll see you later.